Hello and welcome to Earthcast, a platform for discussions about bridging the resource gap between people and planet. I am Olivia Taylor, or Olivia Earth on the socials, your host, and I will be interviewing a series of change makers, thinkers and disruptors, and asking them about their areas of expertise. Together, we will discover fresh perspectives and the most useful levers in society for change. The main question that we will explore is how are trade-offs made between people, planet and profit? More specifically, how do we solve wicked problems and make decisions at the margin? If you would like to hear more from Earthcast, subscribe to the podcast and follow us on social media. Hello and welcome to episode 20 of Earthcast. Today I have the pleasure of interviewing Dr Harriet Davies-Mostert, who is the head of conservation at the Endangered Wildlife Trust in South Africa, where she provides strategic scientific oversight to a diversity of conservation projects across Southern Africa. A trained carnivore conservation biologist, Harriet received a doctorate for her research on African wild dogs from the Wildlife Conservation Research Unit at Oxford University. A council member and former president of the South African Wildlife Management Association, Harriet sits on several national and international committees, including several linked to the IUCN. She has published more than 50 scientific papers and book chapters, and is a fellow of the Eugène Marais Chair of Wildlife Management at the Mammal Research Institute at University of Pretoria. Her main research interests are large carnivore conservation and management, the data science policy interface, and the contribution of the wildlife economy to biodiversity conservation and sustainable development. She also dabbles in road ecology and is passionate about the role of conservation evidence in driving effective action. Harriet, thank you so much for joining me. What do you consider your most successful conservation story?
Hi, Olivia, and thank you very much for having me. I think that, having been a conservationist for quite a long time, there are so many amazing, successful conservation stories that we can talk about. And some of them have really stood out more than others. In my early days, I was involved in a project that looked at conserving honey badgers. And I don't think very many people know about the fact that honey badgers come into a lot of conflict with beekeepers. They are really good at getting into beehives and they destroy them. I think people are, very familiar with the idea of them as being ferocious little animals. And so they can do that. They can get into a beehive and they can destroy a beehive. And a beehive is an expensive piece of equipment for a honey producer, a beekeeper. And so we were finding that there was a lot of conflict going on between honey badgers and beekeepers, and trying to come up with solutions that would prevent this conflict so that beekeepers would be a lot more tolerant. And, colleagues of mine that had worked at the EWT just before I joined had done some tests to show that a honey badger, if you raise the beehive off the ground, a honey badger can't access the bees. And so it was a really good solution, and they worked very closely with the industry to basically get this message across that if beekeepers change the way that they put their hives up, they can actually reduce the incidence of conflict with badgers. So people started doing this, and there was also a really great campaign that was run to try to get everybody to be aware of the fact that they should be supporting what we called honey badger friendly honey. And so it really worked. And so beekeepers started implementing this, and badgers then couldn't get into hives, and then they weren't being gin trapped and poisoned. And I think what's really remarkable is that the honey badger now, it used to be listed as near threatened in South Africa on a regional level, and it's now listed as least concern. So honey badgers used to be listed as near threatened, and now they're listed as least concern, and it's largely because of this amazing solution. And I think for me, what this solution really illustrates is how when it's a win-win, then things can really work. And so although we spent a lot of effort thinking about trying to get consumers aware of badger-friendly honey, the real thing that worked here was that this was a solution that worked for the beekeepers. And so it made sense for them to protect their hives and not have them destroyed. And as a result, badgers were protected in the long term. And this had a real meaningful change on the distribution of badgers in South Africa. So, I mean, I really like these kinds of conservation examples where it makes sense. It's a logical solution. I mean, there's a lot of other ones that are out there. Perhaps another thing that people are aware of is that we've had a long partnership with Eskom and to basically look at trying to reduce the impacts of electricity infrastructure on wildlife. But again, the partnership, it's been running since '96, has been so successful because it's a win-win solution. Eskom need to provide electricity to its customers, and when birds land on power lines and they cause outages, then this causes a loss in business and a loss in revenue. And of course, you know, we as conservationists don't want the birds to be killed when they land on these structures and these power lines. So again, the sort of the fundamental strength of this partnership we've had is built on the win-win, the win for the biodiversity and for conservation being aligned with what's needed for business to be successful and effective.
Harriet, thank you so much for sharing. That's a really, really lovely story. And I'm so struck to hear you talking about that badger story, because I'm definitely one of the people that your campaign and work met, because I'm aware, I didn't know it was the EWT's work that had done this campaign. And, you know, I'm aware of badger friendly honey and often check the labels to see. So yeah, that's such a lovely story. Thank you for sharing. I've heard you say once before, and I quote, that the African wild dog program in South Africa could be a blueprint for managing other endangered species. What exactly, or what do you mean by this practically?
Yeah, so I think it's important just to explain what this program is. And, you know, it's one of the longest running programs that the Endangered Wildlife Trust has been involved in. It started about 20 years ago, and it was really developed because the only viable population of wild dogs in the country at that time was in Kruger National Park, and conservationists were concerned that they would, you know, that this wasn't enough of an insurance policy against sort of future risks that they could be facing. And some very clever people came up with some ideas about using other parks that we had around the country. You know, there's lots of places like Shishlui and Pelosi Park and Pilanesberg that are big enough to contain 1 or 2 packs of wild dogs, but just not big enough to have a really large, viable population that doesn't need any management. And so the idea was that we would move wild dogs, we'd introduce them into these sites and then manage them collectively as one larger population. And it's been running for 20 years, and it's been amazing how the support from the parks themselves, from conservation managers, from the provincial agencies, from researchers and other NGOs have all worked together to make sure that this program is a success. And effectively, it's doubled the number of wild dogs in the country, which I think is really remarkable. We're not seeing those kinds of increases anywhere else across wild dog distribution range. But the reason I think that it's a good blueprint is because, I mean, I suppose it comes from a slightly depressing angle, is that, you know, we know that the human population is growing, and we know that in sub-Saharan Africa, which is really largely where wild dogs are found, that we're expected to have twice as many people here in 2050 than we do at the moment. So this is going to lead to increasing conflicts over land and resources, and we expect these conflicts to escalate as there's more pressure on space, and people are starting to compete more with wildlife and wildlife areas. So we're going to see that the connectivity between reserves and parks and wilderness areas is going to decline as people take up that space. It's not going to be possible for species like wild dogs to move over these vast landscapes and successfully recolonize new places and safely make it through areas where there's loads of people with their livestock and crops and things. And so, unfortunately, we're going to see an increasing sort of set of islands popping up where there is where wilderness and wildlife can thrive, but they're becoming increasingly isolated from other areas. And so our learnings over the last 20 years of how to manage a population of a species that's very complicated, and all of the things that we've done both technically and often through trial and error to make this whole range expansion program work, I think is going to unfortunately be necessary for other large carnivores, potentially other large mammals, elephants, rhinos. I mean, some of the work already is working along similar lines. And I know for lions, for example, that there is a network of reserves that are sort of coordinated together now in South Africa. So unfortunately, it's a blueprint which we would love to be able to avoid. But I think that we've been able to trial it while we've still got time. And we can expand those lessons onto many other species that are going to need it in the future.
Thank you so much for explaining that. I really appreciate that. And then further, when we talk about this blueprint, what would you like more people to know about the conservation of biodiversity? And I mean biodiversity here in general.
Oh, there's so much that people need to learn and understand about biodiversity. I think one of the challenges is that biodiversity is quite a complex concept. And so, I mean, it's easy when you talk about a single species, but when you talk about multiple species in an area, all of them interlinked through the way that they interact within an ecosystem, it's quite a complex concept to get across. I think it's really important for people to understand that biodiversity isn't a luxury. This is not some sort of highfalutin concept that is the realm of well-to-do people, but it's a necessity. Biodiversity is the basis for our clean air and our water. It provides us with goods and services. It provides us with the food we eat. And unless we start to properly account for the negative impacts that we have on biodiversity, I think we're always going to see that our human processes of production and development are going to be damaging. We tend to think of Earth as a sponge, which has this infinite capacity to absorb everything that we throw at it. By providing all of our natural resources and dealing with our waste and other things. But, actually we're understanding more and more that the capacity of Earth to provide these services is finite. And we need to start really thinking very carefully about how we account for the impacts that we have on the environment. And so I would like people to just be more aware of their interaction with nature and to be really cognizant and deliberate about how they think about their use of natural resources and their interactions with the living world around us.
Thank you so much for sharing that. In my limited conservation experience, I've noticed that species conservation is pretty futile without a holistic understanding of the interconnectedness of nature. So how do we create better partnerships for conservation? And how do we open the doors to more integrated discussions about sustainability, especially with focusing on inclusivity and diversity in these discussions?
I think that's a really, really important question. And its answer is going to pave the way to a sustainable future for us and for the planet. I think that when we focus, well, certainly when I do the kind of work I do, and for an organization like the Endangered Wildlife Trust, very often, you tend to focus on particular species, trying to reduce impacts on them and the threats to them. But I think it's really important for us to know that the species don't exist in a vacuum. They occur in, they live in habitats that need to be protected. They live in systems in which people also live. And so, I mean, we've always had a very strong focus that, yes, we're the Endangered Wildlife Trust and we work on species, but very much they're embedded within the habitats and people that they interact with. So we've got those three pillars: saving species, saving habitats, and benefiting people. and we see them as all completely interlinked. I think increasingly we're realizing also that because we have to sort of think about things at landscape level, we can't do this alone. And so you're absolutely right. You know, this holistic understanding of interconnectedness is really essential. And that means very often developing partnerships with organizations that can bring different skills to the table than you might be able to do alone. And so I've definitely seen over the course of the last couple of decades how there's been a much bigger focus on collaboration. You're seeing it from lots of angles, particularly from donors who are often saying that they want to see organizations working together. I think it's also really important for people to understand that conservation is not, it's interdisciplinary. And so very rarely does someone have all the skills that are needed in order to make a conservation project really be a great success. When we talk about, for example, the work that we do with the wild dogs, for example, there's so many different angles to that. Yes, we need the biologists and the ecologists. Yes, we need the reserve managers, but we also need the tourism and hospitality people who are going to bring the visitors to these parks to benefit from seeing the wild dogs and paying money so that we can have better impacts on jobs for community members living next to the parks and those kind of things. There's law, there's policy, there's business, and so I think you've actually completely hit the nail on the head in terms of the kind of partnerships that need to be built. Multidisciplinary ones, NGOs working together, NGOs working with corporations and with government are going to be absolutely critical in order to see the desired sustainability results that we want into the future.
Thank you so much for explaining this multidisciplinary approach. I sometimes think that we forget that this is actually a wicked problem and that there's so many intersecting opportunities and challenges that are involved in these kinds of discussions. So I want to know a little bit further. In your work at EWT, where are the grey areas in your work during decision making? Where does it become difficult to make trade-offs between social issues, environmental concerns, and payroll? Because you've got to pay your staff. So how do you think about these issues?
Well, Olivia, I think that you say, where are the grey areas? I think they're all over the place. Everywhere is a grey area. And I think it's one of the things that you learn, especially as you move more away from being, a specialist into more general conservation management, that you realize that there are very rarely any right or wrong answers, and that you're constantly juggling a whole set of balls to try to come up with the optimal solution. It might not be the best one, but it's the one that fits all of the different, as you mentioned, pressures that you're facing. I think, for example, some people might question why an organization like ours would have a strong relationship with a state-owned enterprise like Eskom. I think that we've been able to show that through this long-term partnership, we really achieved conservation impact, and they have too. So, there is often a challenge when, we're having to think about where we get our funding, where we get our support, and the kinds of people that we want to work with. I think it's been part of our journey that we realized we'd rather always work from the inside, we'd rather work from the inside than to be trying to sort of shout from the rooftops from the outside. We like to think of ourselves as finding solutions that are pragmatic and realistic, and which means that, for example, we're working closely with wind energy developers to try to come up with solutions that reduce mortalities on wind turbines, for example. We work very closely with government to try to guide how best to do mining and developments. And it's not about saying no to mining, it's about saying where should mines happen and how should they be implemented. So I think there's so many places where there are trade-offs. It's particularly challenging in a country like South Africa, where there is deep poverty and inequality, and where things like job creation and resolving poverty and inequality really are very high on the agenda and aren't always seen to be in complete alignment with the conservation of biodiversity. Even though, as I said earlier, I think that's something that we all need to learn, that actually biodiversity underpins pretty much everything we do.
Thanks for really explaining that tension there in that discussion. And I'm really looking forward to seeing what more you do there. But I want to quickly ask you, who have you met or worked with or interviewed or know of that has particularly interesting ideas in your industry?
So I think we're very fortunate in this industry that because people are so passionate about what they do, that we meet, many very interesting, intelligent, innovative and creative people. But somebody that really stands out for me is a good friend of mine, David Johnson, who works at the Margaret Pike Trust. He's based in the UK at the moment, but for a short while he worked out of our offices at the Endangered Wildlife Trust. And his organization, you asked me who do I know in the sector, but actually one could argue that he's not even in the sector, because he works for an organization that tries to meet unmet family planning needs for women and girls around the world. And he has been spearheading this, bringing this challenge into conservation discussions. And it's through a concept called population health and environment, where we recognize that certainly in some parts of the world where people are living close and very dependent on their natural resources, there are often places also where women and girls do not have access to family planning and don't get to make choices about how large their families should be. So where women and children don't have access to family planning and don't get to make choices about how large they want their families to be. And, this puts additional pressure on natural resources. So there are quite a number of organizations around the world now that adopt this approach of cross-sectoral sort of integration of programs, where in some important sites for biodiversity, you have conservation partners working on trying to protect wetlands or other important landscapes. And then you also have family planning partners that are providing services and basic healthcare to people, important members of these communities, the women and the girls. And I think David has, he's a remarkable person who has really spearheaded an uptake of these kinds of ideas across the conservation sector. And he never stops trying to create, you talked earlier about these partnerships that we need to make things work. His energy and belief and passion that this is going to make a big difference in the way that the world pans out in the end. It's infectious and it's really energizing. And so I would really, I think anybody who crosses David's path, I think understands what I'm talking about.
Thank you so much. I wasn't aware of his work, so I really appreciate you introducing me to him personally, but I'm sure the listeners really appreciate that as well. Before I get to the last question, Harriet, I just wanted to say thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate the time that you spent considering these questions and really going through the tension with me. And I wanted to say to the listeners, if you would like to follow more of Harriet's work or would like to get in contact with her, please post a review on this podcast and I will mediate the interaction between, or otherwise you can follow Endangered Wildlife Trust at Endangered Wildlife Trust on Instagram to follow more of their work. So, Harriet, given your expertise, what question should I have asked you?
Oh, thank you, Olivia. I think that maybe it's a question that I actually get asked a lot. And maybe when you're sort of at this stage in your career, this is when you start to get asked these questions by young and up and coming aspiring conservationists, is what should what should I study? What should I do? How do I get into conservation? How can I make a difference? And it's amazing how often I get asked that question. And I just think it's really important for people to know that, and it should be clear from what we've been discussing, that there is such a diversity of needs in conservation, in sustainability, the sustainability space. We need policymakers, we need philosophers, we need economists, we need biologists, we need ecologists, we need trainers and teachers. And based on the last question you asked me, we need medical practitioners and nurses. And so I really think that people should follow their dream and choose what they want to do. And there is always going to be a link to conservation and biodiversity. I think we need to realize that there is a real need for a diverse skill set to deal with the diverse challenges that we have.
Thank you for joining me today at Earthcast. If you enjoyed what you heard, please subscribe to this podcast and leave a review. Let's chat next episode, where I will be asking more creatives and intellectual disruptors about making decisions at the margin. See you next time.